Okay, Nick, I'm very excited to talk with you, speak with you about films, and I want to introduce you to the people. Nick Natalicchio, my film history professor at Drexel University. Nick makes it his mission to educate us on all of film history, whether it be the legendary blockbusters of American film or the soul-crushing and genre-bending narratives of international cinema. I'd like to thank you, Nick, for coming on today and having this talk with me.
Oh, thanks so much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I really appreciate it.
Um, I talked to you a little bit about what my paper wanted to be, sort of a toss up between Steven Soderbergh and David Lynch. Soderbergh, a director with a knack for understanding and manipulating the movie industry, beginning with his powerful low budget debut, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, versus an auteur like David Lynch, who finds his footing in cinematic style in something like Blue Velvet by defying those exact industry standards that Soderbergh is playing to. And in these two very different directorial careers, we see similar fluctuating levels of success and failure. Um, but depending on how you view success and whether you view film more as a commodity or as an art form, I think it's important to understand the legacy that both these directors have left, especially the late and great Mr. Lynch, and their importance in the conversation of Hollywood and cinema at large. So, with that, I wanted to start with Soderbergh.
Sure.
A quick rundown. In our film history class, you showed us Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which was the debut by Soderbergh, who, you know, shortly before that was an uncredited writer on network television. He writes a script that draws the attention of Outlaw Productions, who negotiates a production deal with him to make Sex, Lies, and Videotape at the age of 25. And this is around 1988. And it's such an emotionally mature movie, highlighting the intricacies of infidelity, sexual taboo, and the emergence of late 20th century home video. Um, why don't you just tell me, just basically, wh- when was the first time that you saw this movie? How did it affect you? How did you discover it? What were your thoughts surrounding it?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I saw it many years ago. I was probably in college, actually. I don't remember if it was an assignment or just part of my own exploration in cinema, but it really resonated with me
Hmm.
when I saw it in its ability to confront the topic of sex and the emerging technology of video cameras in a way that really resonated with me, that really spoke to me, I think. And I think you made the point in class, and I thought you put it so perfectly, where you said the film is sex adjacent, or something along those lines, where there's actually not a lot of sex in Sex, Lies, and Videotape,
Right.
right? But it is this exploration of these characters, and how sex is impacting their lives, in a way that's felt very bold to me. And it's also a film. One of the things I really appreciate about it is the intricacy of the characters and how Soderbergh reveals that to the viewer. One scene I think we talked about was the very beginning, where the husband is playing with his wedding ring on his desk, right? And just from that, we can know he doesn't take his marriage seriously, right? Just from that, just from context of that opening scene. So it's a film that is very methodical, I think, in its approach, very provocative in what it's doing, and it's one that I love to show to students.
Yeah, and like you said, sort of at the perfect time for home video, right? Where it's this new technology that it has the power uh, to really play a role in our lives, and Soderbergh sort of capitalizes on that, which I think is very interesting. Again, coming from a 25-year-old who wrote this script um, over the span of a week on a road trip, scrawled on a legal pad, which I think is very it's very fascinating to me. Um, what also fascinates me is how this movie came to be. Coming from Soderbergh, he takes it to Sundance, which you talk about in class, which follows into distribution, and you cannot talk about Soderbergh's startup in Hollywood without talking about Miramax and the Weinsteins.
Sure.
And what do you know about that? What's
Yeah, sure. So just to back up a little bit, so Soderbergh makes Sex, Lies, and Videotape at 25,
Yeah.
right? He screens at Sundance. This is the early days of Sundance,
Yeah.
right? There were international film festivals like the Cannes Film Festival, Venice, and Redford wanted a space for independent filmmakers in America to showcase their work. And Sex, Lies, and Videotape was sort of the prototype for what would become like the independent film gold rush, right?
Right.
Where it was this idea of making independent cinema and finding distribution at places like Sundance. So it really paved the way for a lot of other independent filmmakers to sort of follow in those footsteps. I should say Soderbergh also won the Palme d'Or for the film
Right.
at Cannes. At the age of 26.
Overdo the right thing.
Overdo the right thing. And I believe in his acceptance speech, he said, well, it's all going to be downhill from here. And for a while it was. We could talk about that. But he made a string of flops after Sex, Lies, and Videotape. It took him a while to sort of finding his footing again in the industry. But circling back to your original question, which was...
I guess I just wanted your initial thoughts on that and your understanding of it, and talking about the distribution model.
Right. The Weinsteins, yeah.
Right.
So, when you talk about independent cinema during this time period, Miramax, the Weinsteins, is at the heart of a lot of those conversations.
Yeah.
They were striking deals, they were acquiring films, and giving a voice to filmmakers who are trying to find their place, their way in the industry, and and as we would later find out, there was a lot of abuse and mistreatment, happening, in Hollywood. But at the same time, the company did put a lot of prominent directors on the map, and really had a knack for identifying talent in the industry.
I have a quote here from Elisa Perrin, who writes in her book In Miramax and the Transformation of Hollywood in the 1990s. Despite the company's minimal role in shaping the film's actual development, which Miramax had no part in making Sex, Lies, and Videotape, Miramax was crucial in establishing the film's box office success and its status as a quality independent blockbuster. And so I want to ask you, when you think of quality independent blockbuster in the context of the late 20th century filmscape, what are some of the attributes that come to mind?
Oh, that's a good question. When I think of filmmaking at that point in time, specifically independent filmmaking, to me, it's really about being provocative, like breaking the rules, working with lower budgets, finding young talent to star. Eventually what happened was filmmakers picked up on sort of the type of film Miramax was acquiring, and then just sort of mimicked those attributes and was actually making really bad films. And there was a couple really bad deals, and sort of this gold rush that happened, that it began to dry up a little bit, right? Because people sort of knew how to mimic the traits of a good independent film without actually making a good independent film. But I really think of it in terms of ingenuity, risk taking, and just the audacity to make something. When looking at this point in time, something like El Mariachi, like Robert Rodriguez, right, who shot a film for $7,000, right, on videotape. With no sound, right, or no sync sound, right? He recorded all the audio tracks separately and sank it up in post. The audacity to do that when literally everybody was telling him, no, this is a terrible idea, but still making that film. To me, that's the spirit of independent filmmaking during this period.
When you get into the more gray areas of something like Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing and even Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, are you considering those quality independent blockbusters? Because, Spike Lee's backed by Universal, but it has this look and this feel of an independent film. And you look at Pulp Fiction, it's got all these A-list stars, but still, quote unquote independent film. What do you think of those when you think of?
So I actually consider Do the Right Thing more of an independent film than Pulp Fiction, even though Pulp Fiction, in a true definition, is an independent film, and as you said, Do the Right Thing was backed by Universal, right?
Right.
The reason why is at that point in time, when Pulp Fiction came out, Miramax was purchased by Disney, right? And the industry was already sort of tightening its grip on independent cinema. So yeah, you had Pulp Fiction, which was technically an independent film, but had, Bruce Willis, John Travolta, and like to be fair, Travolta wasn't killing it at that point in his career, but still, it was like A-list actors. It made like 10 million opening weekend. Had like a marketing campaign, and then you have Do the Right Thing, where, as you said, was backed by Universal, which is this historic studio, right? That did like Casablanca, right?
Yeah.
But Spike Lee was at odds with the studio from day one, and to me, had the spirit of an independent filmmaker throughout the making of that film, right? So, from looking at it through that lens, I would say Do the Right Thing, and I love Pulp Fiction. I think, it does a lot of interesting things in terms of nonlinear storytelling. I'm a big Quentin Tarantino fan. But Do the Right Thing, to me, captures the spirit of independent filmmaking during that time a little bit more than Pulp Fiction does.
Especially when you look at those relationships behind the camera and between director and studio, and if they're butting heads or not.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, director and studio clashing, even in like 70s New Hollywood, when we think of like this period of like the auteur, and like all this great filmmaking, it was constant battles,
Right.
So that's just sort of consistent throughout history. But looking with what Spike Lee did with Do the Right Thing, I do consider it to have that, once again, that spirit of an independent film.
The Weinsteins would go on to say, although we market artistic films, we don't use the starving artist mentality in our releases. Our other distributors slap out a movie, put an ad in the newspaper, usually not a very good one, and hope that the audience will find it by miracle. And most often, they don't. It's the distributor's responsibility to find the audience. When you think of the great American films of the last 50 years, do you think that the Weinsteins are right, that movies cannot enter the cultural zeitgeist without having a solid distribution rollout?
Well, it's an interesting question. I will say history has a tendency to sort things out. When looking at David Lynch,
Right.
some of his films, like what is it?
Eraserhead, it was found in the horror flicks.
I was thinking Inward Island or
Inland Empire.
yeah, thank you, Inland Empire. Sorry, I told you I was going to forget it.
No worries.
Inland Empire. Looking at Inland Empire,
Yeah.
did nothing when it came out, right?
Yeah.
Made like very little noise, was not well received. Received a 4K restoration, and now it has all these accolades, and it's sort of finding its audience. So, I do think history remembers correctly. Looking at a film like Wanda, Barbara Loden, like nobody saw Wanda, right? But now it's like this Hallmark film, right? But that's a little tricky, because if I were to go to Universal and say, hey, I'm going to make the next Wanda, I'd get laughed out of the room, right? Like, they don't want to see that. There's no marketability there,
Right.
So I do think history has a tendency to sort it out and remember what, correct, sort of do a self-correct on, on identifying what we should remember, what is important, even if in the moment it didn't even show up on the radar, and, other movies were having success at the box office. But the big point I would make about marketing is just the environment that we're in today versus, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. There used to be several revenue streams, right? You had your opening day box office, in the late 80s, early 90s, that began like the rental, industry, where all of a sudden you could make no money in the box office, but make money in rentals, right? Swingers, Jon Favreau wrote the script, starred in it, and that was one of his early films. Did terrible at the box office, made tons of money in video rentals, right? Clerks, Clerks had legs with video rentals. And then, Later on, you got like premium channels or cable deals, right? And then you had like DVD sales, Blu-ray sales, because people were buying physical media still. So there were all these different revenue ways to make money. So even if you didn't have the best marketing, but you had good word of mouth, and that's like the buzzword in like marketing for film, word of mouth, right?
Right.
That's what you want. Good word of mouth, you could still do okay, you know?
Right.
Even if like you didn't have like a great marketing campaign. And there was only a couple like now there's film festivals everywhere, right?
Right.
But today, I think it's totally different. And I think that quote is more true today than it was when it was said. I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
I mean, do you think the industry we're in now that sentiment has vanished? Of history will find a way of making things heard. Do you think that's still possible, or do you think that's something that's you know of the older days? You know what I mean?
Interesting question. I mean, I guess time will tell. I still think it's true. I do. Um, and I think that in part because of my students. Um, because of talking to you guys, what you're watching, what you're able to identify, as quality. Sometimes it's stuff that's not mainstream, not stuff not that I've heard of. It may be on a platform I've never heard of.
Right.
So I do think people always seek out quality film. But the risk with that is the disappearance of physical media, and that's the other side of it, right? Because we're losing that. Now there's a little bit of gatekeeping in terms of what's available. We're already seeing that. Oh gosh, this is a Soderbergh film. I'm gonna blank on the name, but he hates it. He thinks it's like a terrible film. It's one of his early films, but it's only available as a special feature on the Criterion release of another Soderbergh film. That is the only place you could find the physical media of it.
Yeah.
The entire film is like a special feature on another film,
Right.
right? But we're starting to see things like that where things just aren't available. Just Another Girl in the IRT, which I showed in film history. I had to buy a physical DVD copy on eBay, right? So that there is a risk of things just vanishing, really.
Yeah. I think either way, we see these distribution strategies developing a more sophisticated approach. At least back in the 90s, Miramax would play up this quote-unquote sexiest parts of a film to get audiences interested, even if this was not at the core of what these movies were trying to say. The Weinsteins figured they could construct advertisements into what the movie could be. Perrin writes, ultimately, the interest created in the film because of Miramax's skillful distribution cannot be distinguished from the interest created by virtue of the film's subject matter and storyline. The company played up sex lies and videotape to the press in ways that helped the film move out of the quote-unquote art house ghetto. Do you remember a time when you saw a movie and it wasn't what you anticipated based on the marketing or advertisements you were exposed to about said movie?
I don't know why this sticks out in my mind, but yeah, the film Rounders. It's like an early Matt Damon, Edward Norton film.
Okay.
I remember seeing the trailer and there being a character in the trailer, like speaking lines, everything.
Yeah.
That is not in the film.
Yeah.
Just not in the film.
Yeah.
And there's several examples of that where there's literally scenes that are not in the movie, in the trailer, right? In the marketing campaign, which I think is really interesting. And it's also one of those things where nobody likes to take the blame in Hollywood, right? So if a film flops, the director is going to say it's marketing. Marketing is going to say, well, it's just a bad film. So it's often it's sometimes hard to like pinpoint where things go wrong with like a rollout like that. But certainly I have seen films like. Striptease is a classic example of this, where the trailer is just like Demi Moore stripper, and then you watch the film and something like totally different, than how that was marketed. The poster, the iconic poster of Demi Moore, like naked. They actually had to airbrush it because it didn't meet like censor requirements. Funny story about that. Oh, this is a little bit of a segue, but they like printed a bunch of the posters, and then found out it didn't like meet requirements for like decency requirements to be part of a mass marketing campaign, but it did in Europe. So they just sent all of those to Europe, and had to reprint it for the U.S. But yeah, like striptease is a classic example of that. Anything to get people in butts in seats in the theaters. In terms of marketing.
Yeah, I'm reminded of M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. I think that was quite marketed as something different. And I think about how that affects legacy. And when I think about Shyamalan and The Village, that whole rollout was, way before I was of age to know what that meant. And, I saw the movie years later, and I thought it was great because I wasn't exposed to that marketing. And I think a lot of people were upset when they were going in for like a horror flick, and that's not what they got when they saw all those trailers and stuff.
Right, right.
So, I think that ties into what you were saying before about that sentiment of like, history has a way of, evening things out. Elisa Perrin writes again, few could have anticipated that this relationship would evolve to the point where the pervasive attitude at Sundance a decade later would be buy low, but buy, damn it. Fail to snap up a certain movie and you might miss out on the next $140 million cash cow. Turn up your nose at a trend and the future might pass you by. And what's so interesting about Soderbergh and his career is that he would eventually state his disdain when revisiting Sundance after Sex Lies and Videotape. And so when you have Soderbergh himself condemning his influence, it becomes quite easy to look at the spread of the independent blockbuster as something you'd call, maybe just a little bit soulless. To imitate a piece of art in hopes of entering an industry. What do you think about that? Is it justified to say, just this once I'll play to a formula in hopes of getting somewhere? Or are you sacrificing some artistic integrity when you make the foundation of your work built on formalist ideals?
Well, it's interesting. And once again, going to that gold rush of Sundance and, buy low and, you might be missing out on the next big thing. Blair Witch Project, to me, is like the classic example of that, right? Where it's just like a midnight screening at Sundance. A couple hours later, there's $1 million handshake.
Right.
And then that film goes on to make hundreds of millions of dollars, shot on digital for like a couple $100,000. But no, that's an interesting point. When putting this in the context of Soderbergh and Lynch, it's important to point out that Soderbergh has made like 35 plus films. Mm-hmm. Lynch has made 10, if you're not including like Twin Peaks. Right. 10. Like that's a stark difference, right?
Yeah.
Now Lynch did play the game a little bit at various points.
Talk about that.
So Dune, that was sort of his foray into Hollywood. Huge disaster. I think it's more interesting what he did next, Blue Velvet, which is really doubling down on, the Lynchian style of filmmaking, right? Yeah. But what it's interesting is David Lynch made a Disney film. The Straight Story,
right?
Which is widely regarded as one of his better films, right? But what's interesting about that is Lynch called it one of his most experimental films, because he was trying to see if he could make a David Lynch film while conforming to like Hollywood standards, like Disney standards, right? So for him, it was sort of an experimental film, even though it was sort of one of his more accessible. Elephant Man, I would also say, is like a fairly accessible film. But yeah, so Dune was his sort of foray into Hollywood. Other than that, we just have sort of near misses. Like David Lynch, it's rumored, was offered to direct Return of the Jedi, which he ultimately turned down. One could only imagine what that would have looked like. I mean, it probably would have been a disaster, but to see that film, I would pay a lot of money to see a Lynch directed Return of the Jedi. American Beauty was on his radar at one point. Wow. So there were sort of these interesting almosts.
Yeah.
And then of course there was the like I said, the Straight Line, but typically compared to Soderbergh, you can read I'm rambling at this point, but compared to Soderbergh, Lynch views film as art, right?
Yeah.
and he's even said like he struggles with words sometimes. Like a poet is great with words. He communicates emotion, feeling through cinema. You know, that is a language that he speaks, right?
Right.
To convey feeling, to convey emotion. It is an art form, like a poet writes or an artist paints. He directs, right?
Yeah.
Soderbergh, on the other hand, I think has a more conflicting relationship with film as art that we've seen poke its head out at various points of his career.
The familiar principle of one for the studio, one for yourself suggests that creative workers operate with a dual opposing consciousness, a work for hire mindset that involves no personal artistic stake, and a work for love or work for art perspective that entails passionate commitment and creative satisfaction. But I think you're pushing back on that a little, right? That you can have this sort of uh, simultaneous mindset with something like Lynch with the straight story, where he's working with Disney, but he's also pushing his artistic boundaries there, which I think is really interesting. What do you think when you hear this phrase, "one for me, one for them"? Is it that binary, or can both these mindsets work together? And where have you seen this again?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'd say the most successful person to do that is actually someone in Soderbergh's orbit, George Clooney.
Okay.
Clooney is sort of known for like the one for me, one for them sort of mantra in the film industry, where he'll make like Good Luck and Good Night, and then he'll do like an Ocean's film,
Yeah.
So he has his passion projects, which he sort of like stakes his reputation, his fame to get off the ground.
Yeah.
And he has films that are easily marketable,
Yeah.
right? And Soderbergh and Clooney worked together on Out of Sight, which was like a breakout for both of them. Obviously, they paired together on the Ocean's franchise. But what's interesting with Soderbergh, he does at times, looking at his career, sort of feel like he's in conflict with himself. So as I said, he did Sex, Lies, and Videotape. He wins like the big prize at Cannes Film Festival. He does a series of flops. Grey's Anatomy, King of the Hill, nothing to do with the TV shows, just the titles of the films. Chesmania, no, Chestasm.
Did you mention Schizopolis? Or
Schizopolis.
did you say Kafka too? Did I miss that one?
Kafka is in this time
Yeah,
period.
right.
Yeah. So those were all pretty big flops.
Yeah, right.
I do think so. For some of those, I think he was trying to return to form to a certain extent. I feel like he was a little bit lost maybe after the success of Sex, Lies, and Videotape.
Yeah.
And so there was sort of this period of like experimentation with what he was doing.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, he does get the breakout film with Out of Sight, George Clooney, Jennifer Lopez, right? And that film does very well. And then, that sort of launches his career to a certain extent. We could fast forward, 5 years later to 2000, where he's nominated for Best Director for 2 films the same year at the Academy Awards.
Right.
Traffic and Aaron Brockovich, right? So that he has this like string of hits. I think Traffic would go on to win Best Picture that year. Julia Roberts would get her Oscar for Aaron Brockovich. But what does he do next after those 2 films?
What does he do?
He does Full Frontal.
Okay.
Which I have to think he knew, and everybody knew, that was going to flop, right? It's like abstract. It doesn't make sense, and I think it's a little bit of Soderbergh saying, I don't like who I've become to a certain extent. And so he does something that's so in left field that I have to think it was almost like a rebuke of his previous work. Of his like newfound role as like Hollywood darling filmmaker.
Right.
He has to do something that's a little bit more. He intentionally did something that wasn't mainstream, right? Following up the success of those 2 films, which I think is really, really interesting. But then, of course, he would do the Ocean's films. He would do Magic Mike.
Right.
But on that, not to beat up on Soderbergh too much. it's really hard to make a good film.
Yeah.
You know, even if it's Ocean's 11, it's really hard to make anything that people enjoy and makes money. And um, you know, Soderbergh had like he announced he retired and then he's come back and his focus does seem to be more on making entertaining films as opposed to films as art, you know. But like Logan Lucky, I love that film, right? I think critics called it Ocean 7-Eleven, right? But you know, that's not like it, you know, like an art house film or anything, right? It's just an entertaining film, right? So, you know, I don't want to sell Soderbergh too short in what he's doing. But it does often feel like there's two filmmakers sort of duking it out in his head at various points. But he has had a willingness to play the game much more so than looking at somebody like David Lynch, who had like serious funding issues,
Right.
you know, especially towards the end of his career.
You bring up some really, really interesting points and stuff I've thought about a lot while thinking about this paper and thinking about talking with you. Um, George Clooney, this kind of ties into something I quote here from author M. Gallagher, who pushes back to this same binary idea of one for me, one for them, with the actor and director John Cassavetes.
Cassavetes, yeah.
He writes, however, Cassavetes asserted his artistic integrity and justified his professional choices. His performances in studio productions were essential to the steady progression of his directorial career. His romantic enshrinement as uncompromising independent filmmaker should not overshadow his broader profile as film industry professional. Efforts to demarcate spheres of artistic engagement and disengagement on the part of film critics, historians, distributors, and cinephile communities overall, perpetuate untenable binaries about the nature of creative labor in U.S. and global film industries. I think it's quite interesting that when we talk about Cassavetes and we talk about Clooney, we talk about his films that are independent in the truest sense of the word, I believe. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we're talking in regards to Cassavetes more about Faces, A Woman Under the Influence, than we are talking about like Mikey and Nicky or Rosemary's Baby. You know, it's a different like we prioritize. I feel like those stories that stand the test of time in the directorial sense. If that makes it, does that?
Absolutely. Well, and just to clarify, so like Rosemary's Baby, I think is a wonderful film directed by Polanski that Cassavetes stars in. So I mean, I do think like Rosemary's Baby has like, you know, artistic merit that should be celebrated. But when looking at it in the context of Cassavetes, yeah, like A Woman Under the, like you said, Faces, A Woman Under the Influence, like certainly that's what the conversation is.
The conversation, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Films that tackle these taboo topics while pushing at the status quo, and it's even more interesting when you get to Soderbergh. That conversation drastically changes for some reason, described as the indie hero whose films nobody goes to see. When you look at Soderbergh's deep dive into like the Cuban Revolution and Che,
yeah, the definitive biopic of Che, yeah.
But when you put it up against like his all-star Ocean's 11, I think you'll find the key word when talking about Soderbergh is like inconsistency and not versatility. Why is some of Soderbergh's most precious work, like Che, being swept under the rug? Do you think it could have something to do with the commercial sphere he's put himself in, as we talked about?
Yeah, that's a good point. Sort of like, how will Soderbergh be remembered when all is said and done? Yeah, I mean, I think the jury's still out on that to a certain extent. Although I will push back on that a little bit. There has been, so Solaris, I would say, is a film that when it came out, just an example, was totally panned. Nobody went to see it. Like bad reviews. I would say it's been rediscovered a little bit recently, sort of as like a misunderstood film. But I do want to point out, and I think this is important, that Soderbergh experiments in other ways that's not just film aesthetic. Like with Solaris, he actually released direct to streaming simultaneously with an in-theater release. Nobody was doing that at this point, and people thought he was crazy for it. Of course, that's like you know, commonplace today, right? which I think is really interesting that he had like that foresight. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think if we're being honest, the obituary will probably say Steven Soderbergh, director of the Magic Mike and Ocean's franchises, right? And maybe like third paragraph down, we'll get into like Che and yeah, obviously like Traffic and Aaron Brockovich, Oscar winner, but it'd probably be like a few paragraphs down when we get to Sex, Lies, and Videotape. Some of his other lesser known films. Yeah, so it is interesting. He is fairly unique in his ability to do. He's fairly unique in the career that he's had. I will say that.
Right. Yeah. This ability to understand the market and sort of
Right.
both play to it and defy it, I think is quite something. But I want to talk about your students, and I want to talk about what people think when you show them Sex, Lies, and Videotape. What's the reactions there?
Yeah. It's varied. I have a lot of students who are a little bit who don't know what to make of it. I'll put it that way. A lot of students who don't know what to make of it, and some of it is a disconnect. Where the one of the points of the film is sort of like addressing this new technology and like how we'll influence our lives in ways other than okay, use like a film camera to make films. Well, okay, how else can we use a videotape? Like a video camera, right? Because that was new and it was accessible and we could use it in other ways. And I think that was like a more prescient issue when the film came out. And now we all have like cameras in our pockets and we use them in a variety of different ways, and we're not sort of doing that exploration. And I think we view sex differently too than we did when the film originally came out. It is a film where I think performance is key, cinematography is key. It's always moving. There's no static shot. You don't think of it as being like a film that moves a lot, but there's always like a slow pan in every shot, right? And once again, Soderbergh's ability to communicate key information about his characters, through small details that you pick up on. It's a film, the more you pay attention to it, I think, certainly there's like little hints there for us to find that tell us more about these characters. The soundscape, which I think often gets overlooked, but it has like a wonderful soundscape to it as well, that I think I might have talked about a little bit.
Yeah, it's really a brilliant film, and I know it sounds like I'm knocking Soderbergh a lot, but I was really drawn to write this paper because I was so moved by this film, and as you say, he just has this great knack for visual storytelling. I remember when they first show the videotapes of James Spader and it's on the TV, and you're just like, what are you watching? And then it cuts to like a box of tapes, and then it's like boom, with that one cut, sort of what this guy is about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And Spader, it's worth pointing out. He would sort of be known for these like provocative roles, right?
Right.
Whether it's this film or Crash, or Secretary. He sort of did these like sexual psychodrama, dramas that he sort of became known for, like playing these types of roles.
Yeah.
But that sort of like started with this film, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it can be tricky because for me, in one sense, the film should transcend a director's opinion of it, and we've been taught that by the late and great David Lynch, who calls his 1977 debut Eraserhead his most spiritual film, and won't say anything else in regards to, his work.
Yeah.
But when Soderbergh disavows his early features, it makes me really wonder: did you really put your heart into this? Are you proud of this?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question. So David Lynch is famous for refusing to explain his films,
Right.
And I don't think it's like. I don't think it's like malicious or anything. I just think he thinks art shouldn't be or can't be explained, right? And his whole thing is, it's less about what it means and it's more about how it makes you feel. And he's a big proponent of like transcendental meditation,
Right.
and that's like apparently how he got a lot of his ideas. But sort of his rationale was we have sort of these like ideas on a surface level that are small. So think of it like a lake. There's like small fish swimming like shallow in the water, but then the deeper we go, there's like these bigger creatures, right? Sort of like lurking, and a lot of it's really dark. A lot of Lynch's films are very dark. And his films sort of try to unlock that deeper layer, right? And so I think in his mind, explaining his films sort of do a disservice to the viewer who is having their own emotional response to what they're seeing and unlocking, sort of that like subconscious, unlocking the subconscious, as they react to it. So he's famous for not explaining his films. Yeah, in terms of Soderbergh disavowing his films, I think Sofia Coppola actually has the best approach to it. Where because Francis Ford Coppola is like known for tinkering with his films, right? I mean, so is like George Lucas, but there's like 7 different versions of Apocalypse Now, and but she said, I'll never trim the baby fat off of my early films, right? Meaning, Virgin Suicides is not the film she would make today, but it represents where she was as a director in that moment. And she wants that preserved, right? She wants the baby fat, right? And I think that's an interesting way to look at it. That films, even if they don't work out, they are a reflection of where we are in that moment. And I think that has significance, especially when looking at somebody like David Soderbergh, where we want to be able to like dissect his career. I think being able to see all those pieces is a big part of that. He has disavowed several of his films.
That's very well put. And I can't help but be inspired by Lynch and his artistic integrity. Just making Blue Velvet in 1986, like you said, right after the catastrophe that was Dune, and he vows to never forego his Final Cut privilege for the rest of his career.
Yes.
And what follows is a stricter budget, but more creative liberties. I have this excerpt here. Drawing on her collective experience of the movies, memories of childhood movie houses, and the aroma of fresh popcorn at the Saturday matinee, the opening summons us to a world of illusion. The score triggers both the remembered sanctuary of the theater and the apprehension of rushing down streets suddenly dark and unfamiliar to find our way back home from this fantasy world. Responding to Lynch's Blue Velvet, we nudge the person next to us and pronounce our regrets. They don't make movies like this anymore. Can you tell me what your students think about Blue Velvet?
I can. And first, let me just say Blue Velvet, just going back to what I was saying about David Lynch earlier, I think I told our class this story of Roger Ebert gave it like a glowing review when he was being interviewed at a film festival. This is Mulholland Drive. He gave a glowing review to Mulholland Drive, and he was being interviewed, and the question was, how can you give this film a positive review when you don't know what it's about? And he said, I don't know what it's about, but I know how it made me feel, right? And that's how I try to view any film by David Lynch that I show. A lot of times students get caught up in, well, what is happening? What does this mean? And, that's not the right question. The right question is, how is what you're seeing making you feel? That's really the key for me, for David Lynch. So Blue Velvet, I will say, your class handled it the best out of any class I've ever had. I've showed it in the past, and there's been like a lot of laughter, especially to like the sexual assault scenes, which to a certain extent I understand because you're so shocked by what you're seeing. I think you often don't know what a proper emotional response is. Yeah. And sometimes that comes out in funny ways, like laughter. I don't think anybody thought what they were seeing was funny. I just think they were shocked and didn't know how to respond, right? And sort of that's how it came out. But I've had students laugh. I've had students like walk out, say like they couldn't see this, which of course I'm understanding of. And I give like a very stern, warning, content advisory before showing it. And of course, I respect the boundaries of my students and don't want to cause them emotional harm.
Right,
And
right.
ultimately, you all decide what you watch.
Yeah.
And I work with you with that. But the reason why I show it though is also to demonstrate what cinema can do, that it can be this provocative. But your class really handled it well. It seemed to really resonate. I think I say like a few of you will walk out totally disgusted. A few of you will have found your new favorite film, right? But I think it's important, especially when looking at the time period of the 1980s. And I know I showed like Back to the Future, right? And, we're coming out of 70s Hollywood. There was emergence of the blockbuster, the rise of the religious right, fear of boycotts, but culture is a pendulum, and if you swing really far to the right, it's also going to swing really far to the left, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we get films like Blue Velvet, sort of in response to what was going on, in the industry, and sort of like filling that cultural void of this big swing to conservatism in what we were consuming, what we were watching. But yeah, the response certainly is varied, but I do think it's an important film to show.
Yeah, and the thing about the laughing too, I think I read that Lynch actually, had a laughing fit himself when shooting that scene in Dorothy's apartment, which just goes to show, I think, that we all have different reactions to those things, and they're not necessarily malicious ones. Just how something in the brain, and like you said, just the varying range of impression that you get from those students that walk out, they'll hate it, or it's their new favorite film.
Right.
I find it fascinating to me too that this inverse of my opinion of Blue Velvet is actually quite, I wouldn't say negative, but it's not something that I have really resonated with, especially watching other Lynch's work, where I can sort of see Eraserhead, and I can see like the story of this father, coming to terms with having a child, and just all the things that come with that, and having this sort of warmth throughout Eraserhead, with the lady in the radiator and all these things that just make me both terrified but also just at home and sort of understanding what Lynch is trying to say. Blue Velvet, on the other hand, I've felt very like it's like a wall. It's like a stone wall, and I can't get through to it, and I don't know why. Partially because I have trouble with the whole parts of the sexual endeavors of Jeffrey that to me just have always felt unnecessary, no matter how many times I watch this film. Are there talks of like male gazy things happening in Blue Velvet with your students, or just in general as you've come across the film?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And, for many, it is a difficult film to watch, and understandably so. There's many sequences that are, very disturbing. And the film is an exploration of, this idea of the suburbs and, like Americana, like American imagery, the white picket fence, but, the corruption, that's just beneath the surface there, of what's really going on in this town, where many are shocked by what's actually going on, right? But Jeffrey becomes sucked into it and actually becomes a part of it to a certain extent, right? And sort of unlocks something that's very dark within himself.
Right.
I'm sorry, what was the original question?
When you think about a lot of your students watching this, is there the question or the issue of male gaze?
Yes, and so this is something that we often talk about, and I feel like it's a trap that a lot of especially male filmmakers especially fall into, in that you want to like deconstruct the male gaze, but you do so by making a film that has the male gaze. Like, I think Taxi Driver is a perfect example of this, right? Scorsese always, nobody else thinks this, but Scorsese said like, oh, Taxi Driver is like a feminist film because it shows like toxic masculinity coming to its logical conclusion, right? And we see sort of like the rise and fall of Travis Bickle, even though it does have this sort of like wish fulfillment ending, right? But by doing that, he makes a film about a toxic male character that we see the world through his lens, right? So it is sort of a little bit of having your cake and eating it too.
You think Blue Velvet is like that as well?
I do to a certain extent. Yeah, yeah.
It, and it's interesting, right? Because I think I find myself thinking about Sex, Lies, and Videotape and thinking, how did Soderbergh do this? But when I'm thinking about Blue Velvet, I'm thinking, how does it make me feel? What does this
Right.
mean? And
Right.
and when you look at the careers of these directors, um, I just can't help but be inspired by Lynch's commitment to everything that he has done.
Sure. Yeah. And if I could just say the influence of Lynch is really immeasurable when looking at like just looking at Twin Peaks, right?
Yeah.
Just identifying that was a TV show where it wasn't like one murder per episode being solved. The entire first season is about one murder that happened in this town, and that story is told over a series of episodes, right?
Right.
This was before prestige television, like before The Wire, Sopranos. I don't think we would have that without Twin Peaks, right? It was really revolutionary in its format, but also its use of surrealism. And you can't really talk about David Lynch without talking about surrealism.
Yeah.
And shows like Atlanta, you could draw like a straight, like I think even, Donald Glover said, I want to do Twin Peaks, but with black characters in Atlanta, right? And there is like all this surreal, and in that case, it's like Afro surrealism. But it's easy to draw a line from one to the other. So the influence of Lynch is profound. Even though we only have, like I said, I think 10 films, and he did have budgetary constraints. And the other point I want to make about Lynch, especially compared to Soderbergh, is he dabbled in other art forms. He was a trained painter. He made over 40 short films. And he had a music career. He put out like several music albums.
A true artist.
Absolutely, absolutely.
What do you think? And I know it's comparison. They say is the thief of joy, right? And we don't want to look at these two directors and say, which one leaves a greater legacy. But I have to ask you, which one do you believe leaves a greater legacy?
It's an interesting question. And once again, if I go home and Ocean's 13 is on, I'm going to watch it. It's a fun movie. It's a well done movie. I was reading like a review of Magic Mike 3, which I've never seen in all fairness, but the review was talking about how it like addresses issues of like aging and, for these characters. And it's like, there might be something else actually going on there a little bit, but when looking at their overall careers, I think Lynch would probably have the greater impact. I think in terms of influence on the industry, but that's not to, sell short Soderbergh,
right?
Who I think is not only a competent filmmaker but an excellent filmmaker.
Would it be more accurate to say that Lynch has more impact on the art form of cinema, and Soderbergh might have more impact on the industry because he just had that innovative entrepreneurial take to it?
Yeah, I think that'd be fair to say. Because
you look at 10 films and you look at 35. It's quite powerful to say that Lynch is in that conversation, maybe even above Soderbergh in the art form and the form of cinema itself, which I think has led me to rewatch Blue Velvet and try to understand it more, but also while still, like you said, just taking it in, being there, and my professor says to experience the erotics of art and to just take in what you're seeing and visualizing and seeing how it makes you feel. That's pretty much all the questions I had, Nick. Is there anything else you'd like to say in this conversation?
No, it was a great conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me in. I mean, it's two filmmakers that I really admire and enjoy watching their work. And it's two films I have a lot of fun showing my students, Blue Velvet and Sex, Lies, and Videotape. I think they're important films and they should be shown and studied and talked about. So I appreciate having the opportunity.
Well, I gotta say, what is the if I had to walk out, watch 2 movies tonight, one from Soderbergh, one from Lynch, what would you recommend?
Oh man, have you seen Out of Sight?
No.
Okay, so Out of Sight, it does do something really good. I mean, it is sort of on its face, just like, okay, George Clooney, Jennifer Lopez, like action film, like he's a bank robber, she's like a federal agent type thing, but there's just like palpable chemistry there and it's just like a really well executed film that I think maybe doesn't actually get the credit it deserves, and just even Soderbergh's ability to identify Clooney in that point in time as a leading man, which he was not considered. He didn't get. That film was really the first that showed him that way. So I would say that film for Soderbergh, and for Logan Lucky too. I think I mentioned I really like Logan Lucky. It's just fun. For Lynch, once again, I'm going to forget the name of it. Please edit this. What is it? Young at Heart with Nicolas Cage.
Wild at Heart.
Wild at Heart. Thank you. Wild at Heart with Nicolas Cage.
Won the Palme d'Or.
Well, yeah, absolutely, it did. Yeah. And I think it was a polarizing film when it came out, but to me, it's sort of like quintessential Nick Cage, and it's a film. I wouldn't necessarily call it even like a typical Lynch film, but it's one that I enjoy. I think it's one that should be in the conversation more, maybe when looking at his body of work, because I think he does a tremendous job with it.
Right. Well, I'll check those out. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Cut. Thank you so much.